You are now listening to theGrio's Black Podcast Network, Black Culture Amplified.
What's the difference between a microaggression and plain old regular dollar store racism? Is disproportionate police brutality different from lynching? And what the hell is systemic racism? I'm Michael Harriot, world-famous white peopleologist, and this is theGrio Daily, the only podcast that knows the difference between systemic racism and white people complaining. So today we're going to talk about systemic racism. A lot of white people don't even believe that systemic racism exists. And that's because a lot of white people have made up their own definition of racism. Like, take this tweet from this guy on Twitter. He tweeted at me, "Define systemic racism, because if racism isn't institutionalized and codified into law or regulation, then how is it systemic? Racism is a problem certain individuals have, and they may impact systems and institutions themselves, but there is no legality to racism." Like, I don't know, like this guy created his whole definition of systemic racism that has nothing to do with reality, because the dictionary defines systemic as something that is fundamental to a predominant social, economic, or political practice. And it defines racism, and I know we've talked about it before, but it defines racism as the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another, or a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. Now, to understand this, we can go through a lot of examples, but the takeaway is that systemic racism is fundamental. It doesn't have to be intentional. It just has to be fundamental. It has to be endemic. It has to be something that affects a system. Take lynchings, like the history of lynchings, for instance, right? What comprises a lynching, right? Like, if you look up the definition of lynching, it doesn't say like a person has to be hung by a noose by persons carrying a pitchfork, right? So in the 1800s and the early 1900s, lynchings weren't just like we like to think of them as, mob violence by hanging someone from a tree. But a lot of lynchings, in fact, most lynchings weren't necessarily hangings. One of the worst lynchings in history, Sam Ho's, they just, and this is sad, trigger warning, they just set him on fire, and then they invited the crowd to come forward, take parts of his body with their pocket knives home as souvenirs. But it was a lynching. A lot of lynchings were just plain old shootings, like the lynching in Eufaula, Alabama in 1868. It was just a regular lynching, but what they did is they just shot Black people who were trying to vote. So the same is true with systemic racism, because lynchings was a systemic way to protect white people and to enact extrajudicial justice against Black people. Lynchings was white people's system of oppressing Black people, right? Oppressing the vote, oppressing their ability to participate in democracy, or just their ability to be free. It was systemic racism. Or take schools, for instance, right? Like, so because the homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued on average about $48,000 per home, and that's tied to the history of redlining. It's tied to the history of segregation. It is systemic racism. The way we fund schools is systemically racist. Majority white districts are funded on average about $2,666 per student more than majority Black school districts. It's not because they intended it to. It's just because historically, Black people have been disempowered economically. But it affects a system, and it is part of a system that oppresses Black children or Black students in public schools So the way we fund schools is systemically racist. Or like, this is a good example, right? Take prison sentences, for instance, right? So a study by the United States federal government shows that Black people who are convicted of a crime are sentenced on average about 19.6, so about 20% longer to prison than white people with the same criminal history who committed the same crimes, right? So Black people who commit the same crimes as white people are sentenced to longer sentences. But there's no law that says like you got to sentence a Black person to a longer sentence, right? As a matter of fact, it's really actually unconstitutional. But that system is pervasive throughout the court system. In federal courts, it's pervasive. In local courts, in district courts, it's pervasive. It is part of a phenomenon of this system that oppresses Black people who are convicted of crimes. It is systemically racist. And the same is true for the way police patrol Black neighborhoods, right? Like we know that white people actually use more drugs than Black people, but Black people are 3 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession because the system of policing systemically targets Black people. There's no other way to explain it except systemic racism. Because, I mean, they don't teach you in the police academy, hey, arrest the Black people when you see them. It's not a part of a policy in the police manual, but it exists. And because it exists and is pervasive throughout the country, it is systemic racism. A good example is what happened recently at BYU. Now, I don't know if you heard about this, but so BYU's volleyball team invited Duke's volleyball team to a tournament. And there were a bunch of people there. It was about 6,000 people there. And during the volleyball match, a guy started hurling racial slurs at Duke's only Black starting volleyball. And nobody did anything. And he kept yelling it, and nobody did anything. And so finally, they sent police down to the Duke volleyball team's bench, supposedly, to protect the student volleyball player, right? And after the incident, after the volleyball match, what BYU did is they said, well, okay, since this happened, we're going to stop crowds from coming to the rest of the matches in the tournament, and we're going to apologize, and we're going to condemn the actions of this lone racist. The lone racist. It was just one guy being racist. But in reality, this is an example of systemic racism.
Even if, as they say, it wasn't a student who was doing this, there were students nearby. And so the fact that they didn't know what to do in the moment to call him out or to let him know that's not accepted here, you need to stop. Like, that's not wanted here. It's a level of ignorance.
Imagine that you were in a crowd that wasn't racist, and you just started hurling racial slurs. What would the people in the crowd do? They would tell you to shut the hell up. They would call the police on you. You know, white people will call the police. They would do something to stop you. Like, it's the same reason that people don't, like, take a squat in the mall parking lot. Because, you know, there's no sign that says you can't doo-doo in the parking lot, right? You can doo-doo at a campground and nobody will think it's crazy. But if you do it in Walmart's parking lot, people will think you're crazy. People will call the police on you. And even if you say, well, there ain't no sign, I ain't never seen no rule that says you can't shit in the Walmart parking lot, people are generally constrained by social norms. But this one guy, supposedly, who was the lone racist at BYU, he was not constrained because he knew he was surrounded by people who wouldn't think his actions are crazy. See, BYU is one of the whitest institutions in America. BYU is whiter than the country of Switzerland. BYU has less black people than the country of Switzerland. BYU is less than 1% black. BYU has never had a single moment in its more than a century history where its student population has been more than 1%. As a matter of fact, of the top 100 schools in America, there are only 3 schools that are whiter than BYU or less diverse than BYU. Clemson University, a Jewish school, and a school for forestry. That's it. Those are the only schools in the top 100 that are less diverse than BYU. So this student, this so-called lone racist, knew that he was going to a place where he was protected by people who thought like him. Because if he didn't, he would be constrained by the social norms in the place that he was going. As a matter of fact, BYU thought that it was important to point out that the dude who was hurling these racial slurs wasn't a student at BYU. So this dude wasn't a student. He didn't go to school there, even though he was in the student section. He was just a dude who intentionally picked the one place where he could hurl racial slurs, or maybe he was just a volleyball fan, right? Maybe, like, I don't know. But the reality is the system that makes BYU very white is the same system that protected this so-called lone racist as he yelled racial slurs. Well, how can you say the white people are there because of a system? Well, see, here's the thing. BYU is a private university, and most of its funding comes from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And part of their policy for most of that church's existence was to do what they call denying black people the priesthood. So they believed, like, the tenet of this religion was that black people wouldn't go to heaven, that black people were genetically predisposed to being evil, that black people bore what they called the curse of Ham, that God himself had cursed black people. And because black people couldn't go to heaven or what they call hold the priesthood, you couldn't advance in the church. You couldn't become part of the priesthood. You couldn't become part of the church's hierarchy. And you definitely couldn't get a scholarship or walked into that religion's most important institution of higher learning. So that institution of higher learning was protected by the system that oppressed black people, that literally believed that black people couldn't go to heaven. Like, what is more oppressive than that? And because of that, remember this policy, or maybe I didn't say this, but that church rescinded that policy in 1976. So if you look at BYU's student population, it's majority white because of that system. If you look at the population of Provo, Utah, or nearby Salt Lake City, it's protected by that system that was perpetuated by that church. You know, there are NBA players who are asked, what is the most racist city you can play in? And people always expect them to say Boston, but they always say, oh, nah, it's when we visit the Utah Jazz. Because that system perpetuates the oppression of black people. And it's not codified. Well, in the case of of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it is kind of codified, but they rescinded it, but it still exists. But it still perpetuates that oppression. And so, despite what this tweeter would have you believe, oppression doesn't have to be written down for it to be systemically racist. You know, that's just something that white people made up in their head. That's just something they believe with no evidence. Everything disputes what they say. History disputes it. The dictionary disputes it. The actual meaning of words disputes it, right? And if you want to pretend that racism is a two-way street, you have to ask yourself, why is there a system that builds racist streets? And that's because systemic racism built it. And the only thing that you can do to dismantle it is to download the GRIO app, to subscribe, to tell a friend, and to remember that we will always leave you with a Black saying. And today's Black saying is, don't stop till you get enough, unless you're talking about racism. And then, of course, we've always had enough. We'll see you later on the GRIO Daily.
Thank you for listening to the GRIO Daily. If you liked what you heard, please give us a 5-star review, download the GRIO app, subscribe to the show, and share it with everyone you know. Please email all questions, suggestions, and compliments to podcasts@thegrio.com.
The GRIO Black Podcast Network is here, and it's everything you've been waiting for. News, talk, entertainment, sports, and today's issues, all from the Black perspective. Ready for real talk and Black culture amplified? Be inspired. Listen to new and established voices now on the GRIO Black Podcast Network. Listen today on the GRIO mobile app and tune in everywhere great podcasts are heard.